My daughter-in-law raised her glass at the Christmas table and said, "From now on, I will manage this family's money." I smiled and answered, "You have no idea." The room held that strange, sudden silence that falls when a spoon catches on crystal and everyone looks up. The roasted turkey steamed between platters of sweet potatoes and a bowl of mole that filled the kitchen with the smoke of cinnamon and chile. Candlelight trembled across the tablecloth. My reboso lay across my lap, its wool warm from the kitchen stove, fingers remembering the pattern that Doña Estela had taught me decades before. I felt Rodrigo's hand in mine for half a breath, hesitant, loyal, torn, and I saw Valeria smile, small and bright, like someone who had practiced this moment in a mirror. She thought she had the room. She didn't see what I had kept folded under this reboso for 40 years. Quiet deeds, a stack of leases, notes signed in a cramped script at dawn, the stubborn stubbornness that had survived hunger and grief. She didn't know that the reason I had never shown Rodrigo the house titles on the shelf was not shame, but protection. I had promised something to a child I held when the world was small and terrifying. I had made that promise into bricks. Before I tell you what happened that night, I have to go back, because the way I sat at that table, smiling, listening to the glass click, was shaped by everything that came before. If you want to stay with this story, if it matters to you that an old woman learned how to build and guard what she made, then please like this video and subscribe. There are truths here that deserve time. They told me once that grief should pass like a season. When Javier died, it was more like a country had been taken from me overnight. He left me with the sound of his boots on the floor and a note folded into his pocket. Names and debts and a small, foolish list of unfinished things. I was 26, and the baby in my belly was already feeling what hunger meant. There are smells that become memory. The smell of the soap that my mother used to scrub our shirts with, the steam of rice on Sunday mornings, the oil from the singer machine when I learned to stitch by lamplight. Those things kept me awake. I taught myself to make dresses, then curtains, then small things that women in the neighborhood wanted. I sewed with my knees hooked under a table while the radio hummed boleros and the night cooled, and I took that money to buy bread and milk. Each coin felt like a promise kept. Doña Estela found me at that table one rainy afternoon, her umbrella dripping onto my doorstep, as if she had come to measure the foundation of the house I had not yet built. She was older and faster with an opinion than anyone I had known. She ran a small lending circle and a hand-stitched market of apartments that she rented to families who paid their rent with care, not just coin.
She taught me the names of things I had feared: mortgage, title, escrow, by telling me stories instead of lecturing. "A deed is a promise, mi hija," she would say, tapping the table. "It tells the world you were here." Her tutelage was a slow work of love. We would sit in the back of her tiny office between stacks of paper, the fans slicing the afternoon in lazy rhythms, and she would instruct me on how to read a lease as if it were a human face. "Look for what it hides," she'd say. "What is spoken is not always what is owed." I remember the first time she took me to see a property. It was a narrow house with shutters like tired eyes, paint flaking from the jam. The tenant who opened the door hugged us like family, because Doña Estela had remembered the birthday of his daughter 3 years earlier. That landlord collected kindness as well as rent, and he had a heart that paid. We made an agreement on a folded napkin and an exchange of smiles. I learned the math of care as much as the math of money. A house that shelters has more value than a ledger sometimes reveals. With Doña Estela came the small laws of perseverance. She taught me to put aside a portion of every payment as if it were a seed. "When the drought comes," she said, "you'll be glad you planted." So I planted. The business grew in fits and starts. An apartment here, a small shop there, kept secret like a private litany, because pride can be as dangerous as charity. When Rodrigo was born, I kept the ledger closer. I thought of him like a garden I wanted to protect from the goats and from envy. People imagine that one becomes wealthy in a night or a scheme. My wealth, such as it was nothing like those fairy tales. It was a slow climbing, the accumulation of small contracts, of a tenant who paid on time for 30 years and left a key to an attic flat in a drawer, of an inheritance an elderly cousin forgot to spend. I learned to read legal forms with patience, to meet with Lucido Eduardo Morales, the accountant who smelled of coffee and ink and never hurried me. He kept the books plain and clean and respected the silence I demanded. We registered companies when needed. We paid taxes. I would sign papers in small, deliberate strokes, and they became, together, a quiet roof over my son's future. I had reasons to hide this from Rodrigo. He was generous to a fault, quick to forgive and slower to iron his shirt. I wanted him to learn the muscle of work and the dignity of earning bread without silver spoons. After his father died, Rodrigo capered between being a child and being a man before his time. He learned to shoulder grief like it was wood he carried to the stove. I wanted him to be strong for himself, not strong on my money, so I made a decision that would later complicate everything. I kept my assets as if they were spare clothes folded away from the eyes of the house. Those years taught me also the art of names.
I called accounts by pet names in my head: the singer, the blue house, the pantry, so that even when I felt small, I had things to anchor me. I would not allow myself the vanity of a new coat until I had paid the last plumber. I accepted fast food rarely. Instead, I cooked, and it is a strange and sacred fact that food can mend the edges of a life. The mole my mother taught me to make, with seeds roasted and ground with patience, was a ritual of endurance. When the winter was hardest, I would toast the seeds and remember I could make warmth out of bitterness. Rodrigo grew up with my stern kindness. He learned to mend fences and to count nails when friends needed a hand. He learned the names of tenants and how a complaint about a leaky tap could be as much about loneliness as about water. He loved like a man who had seen how much had to be kept together. I tried, without sermon, to show him the value of a quiet future. But the heart wants what it wants, and when Valeria stepped into the picture, it felt like a small, bright weather front moving into our long season. He met her at a gallery opening where the lights were too white and the wine was too polite. She had that look that was practiced, hair tucked behind one ear, a laugh that fit room acoustics. She wore a coat neutral enough to read as serious and soft enough to seem familiar. Rodrigo came home with a light in his face that I had not seen since he was a boy who had found his first coin. He described her as if he had discovered a new language. I watched her early the way a gardener watches a new plant, curious, careful. She folded into our life with thin skill. She knew how to ask the right question at Sunday dinner, how to remark about the taste of the mole as if she had been taught the recipe by a wise grandmother. She was attentive to my hands, complimenting the calluses instead of being embarrassed by them. She was precise in the places where precision mattered, and vague in the places where vagueness allowed her to remodel perception. There were small signs I did not like. She would rearrange salt and pepper, subtly. She began to call more often, at odd times, with a voice that suggested she had been thinking of our family like a problem to be optimized. Once, when Rodrigo was out in the garage, I found our credit card slipped into a drawer with a receipt from a boutique I had never been to. I mentioned it casually at dinner, and she laughed in that practiced way. Rodrigo shrugged like a child who did not want to see thunder in a clear sky. She paid attention, not to hearts, but to the architecture of advantage. She learned the faces of our tenants and the times they were home. She memorized the names of municipal clerks and smiled like she had always known them. She was not vulgar, she was surgical. There is a way people invade rooms that is not violent, but precise. They speak first, they steer topics, they offer comfort with obligations attached.
She offered to help me with bills once, after she had been with us a few months, and when I declined, she came to our table with documents and said, "It's hard to manage everything alone, Amelia. Let me help. We can make things easier for Rodrigo and the baby." It is here, the offer, that many stories change. I had been a widow once and was not gullible, but I was also a mother, and the image of Rodrigo eased into a future, burden lightened, can make a woman accept terms she would otherwise never sign. I told her no, in a way that was firm and mild. She was not used to refusal. That small disappointment became in her a plan. She started small, a canceled card here, a mistakenly thrown away envelope there. Little humiliations, suggestions that I was old-fashioned when I paid for groceries in cash, a sideways comment at a family lunch about how some of us keep better records. The first real sting was when she took the card they used for household expenses and had the provider cancel it for security reasons without telling me. I remember the day I reached for bills and found the account frozen. I went to Licete Eduardo's office because he was always the map I trusted when I felt lost. He made notes and said little, the way lawyers do when people bring them the messy parts of their lives. Rodrigo sided with her, hesitating like a person standing on a bridge whose ropes creak. He told me it was temporary, that they would sort it out. I remember watching him, feeling the slow realization that the boy I had shaped was learning new definitions of loyalty, ones where discretion could be a weapon against the past. That shift was more painful than the canceled card. Valeria's strategy was never crude. She cultivated friends who could be witnesses to her competence and learned how to make favors into debts. She asked to see my bank statement for a project, and I gave it to her because I trusted her with a confidence I had been foolish enough to offer. Later, she would call it transparency. She began to suggest that we consolidate things to make it easier, to protect the family assets from poor decision-making. She repeatedly used the future tense of Rodrigo's name in a way that implied proprietorship. Our house for Rodrigo, our money for Rodrigo, our choices for Rodrigo. If anyone had asked me then, I would have said, perhaps too naively, that I thought love should be a shelter, not a siege. But manipulation thrives where goodwill is abundant. By the time they were married, the pattern was set. Small permissions became greater claims. Rodrigo loved her. This is not a simple thing to say without acknowledging the pain, but love does not immunize a person from being misled. The escalation was gradual and precise, like a tightening screw. She began to write notes, innocent at first, that suggested improvements to the household budget. She suggested that we move some payments to a joint account for convenience.
There were words she used like a locksmith: safeguard, consolidate, reorganize. To her, consolidation was safety. To me, it was erasure. One night she tried to present a notarized form for me to sign, a document granting limited power of attorney for family matters. I refused again, softly. She smiled then in a way that made me uncomfortable, an expression I would later recognize as disappointment that does not hide resentment. I did not confront her angrily at first because I wanted to be careful. A confrontational mother could look like a jealous one, and the world often sides with the bright, persuasive newcomer. I remembered Doña Estela's words: accuse with facts, not with screams. The loudest voice is sometimes wrong. So I collected facts. Lisette Eduardo began to prepare things not in haste, but in order. We made copies of deeds, of rental agreements, of a letter I had written once to myself when Rodrigo was still small, a promise to him that he would never have to fear losing a roof over his head. Those papers were folded and labeled and taken to a safe place. I told no one outside of the small circle that trusted the truth. Valeria was clever at turning attention away. If I brought up a concern, she would steer the conversation to some flattering observation about Rodrigo's work or her own family's difficulties. She introduced her mother, Rebecca Ortega, into our social orbit with a sweetness that belied the sharpness that lay in her own counsel. Rebecca was mild and spoke in aphorisms about compromise. She would watch me with a polite tilt of her head and say, "We only ever want what's best, Amelia." It can be harder to be on guard against someone who smiles as they take. The subtleties were what I remember most. The way Valeria rearranged the spoons so mine would sit away from the place where the conversation was most animated. The way she would offer me smaller portions as if to communicate my supposed diminished appetite for life. Once she suggested I move to a smaller room, citing my comfort. She used kindness like a wedge. Guests noticed nothing except that she was efficient. She had an uncanny capacity to make efficiency sound like virtue, and virtue sound like debt. At first, I blamed myself for the tiny slights. I had kept my fortune secret in the name of humility, and it had made me vulnerable. I had ached for things, yes, more than shoes, sometimes the sense that my son would see me as I truly was, and that ache made me cautious. Yet there was a line I would not let be crossed. The day she tried to arrange a meeting with a notary regarding our household accounts without my consent, I felt cold with a certainty that went beyond anger. I realized then that her intention was not to help, but to absorb. She wanted to centralize control until my name would become a detail in a ledger. I will not pretend I had a master plan from the beginning. I am not a woman of chess. I am a woman who learned, through labor and hunger, that survival sometimes requires strategy. I called Lisette Eduardo, and together we made a simple, lawful decision: transparency as protection. He advised that the best defense would be to show the truth on my terms, and not in a corner where assumptions could be taken as fact. You cannot shout patience into being, he said, and for once his humor did not soften the gravity of his counsel. It takes a careful mind to handle people's beliefs without splintering them. Before I could act, the fissures spread. Valeria began to speak of managing our affairs as a fait accompli.
She started arriving at meals with receipts tucked in her coat, with proposals about investments she had never asked me to consider before she had learned the names of my properties. She would whisper to Rodrigo in the kitchen, and they would exchange looks like conspirators. I felt like a woman standing on the shore while a boat I had helped build was being rowed away. There were public slights, too. At a birthday dinner for an old neighbor, Valeria commented loudly about obscure stakes and old money, in a tone that suggested such things were shameful. The neighbor's laughter was uncomfortable, the kind that presses against ribs. Later, at family gatherings, someone would ask more pointed questions about finances. It was as if she had trained the room to see me as quaint and not competent. The humiliation of being underestimated is small at first, and then it grows, like a bruise that darkens. Through all of this, I kept my composure. I would fold my reboso, smooth my dress, and do the tasks I had always done. There is dignity in ordinary ritual. But the night our card was canceled, and I had to borrow coins for the bus, I felt a hot shame that did not belong to me. The next morning, I went to licenses and records, and to Lisette Eduardo, and he found small irregularities, signatures that seemed to have been manipulated, a request for an account consolidation that bore a stamp I did not recognize. We began to compile what I had been saving, everything, from the earliest deeds to rental ledgers. We made photocopies and categorized them in a way that my accountant smiled. He liked order. Rodrigo's confusion deepened into strain. He loved his wife. He also felt, in his own way, a filial pull towards me. When the first real argument came, it was quiet and heartbreaking. He stood in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, and asked, "Mama, why didn't you tell me?" It was not the question of accusation I feared. It was the plea to be trusted that shook me. I explained as best I could. A promise made in a small, sleepless hour. The desire not to have him think us rich before he'd learned the value of what he had. I spoke of Doña Estela and of a long line of women who had kept things safe. He understood in the abstract, but it was different to grasp that someone you love had kept a secret the size of a house.
Valeria, meanwhile, pressed her advantage with an elegance that would have fooled a less watchful eye. She started to insist that we make decisions together, to the point of presenting me with forms that presumed shared ownership. When I refused, she suggested gently that I was being difficult. People are often kinder to the person who looks modern. The modern person can be cruel in subtle ways. There were critical nights where I lay awake and tasted the metallic tang of fear. What did I want? Justice? Restoration? To see Rodrigo safe and not manipulated? I did not want to break a marriage or to humiliate a woman for the sake of pride. I wanted to protect what years of work had given me and to ensure that our grandson, if God were kind and gave us one, would not grow up in the shadow of lies. I began to prepare, not in rage, not with vengeance, in the quiet way a woman irons a collar, in the patient way one threads a needle. I gathered deeds and made copies. I wrote a letter to myself, not because I doubted my motives, but because I wanted clarity in case the world spun too fast. I called Lisette Eduardo, and we spoke of legal safeguards, of how one could document ownership without creating spectacle. He nodded and said, "When they take a tone of ownership, show them ownership's receipts." Preparing is also an exercise of imagination. I rehearsed dialogue in my head. I pictured the table at Christmas and the clink of glasses. I imagined how Valeria would raise her voice with a small triumph when she announced that she would take over the finances. I imagined Rodrigo's face, the flicker of confusion, the loyalty making a brief, painful fissure between son and mother. I imagined my own voice, quiet, deliberate, cutting into that moment. There would be no shouting. There would be no scenes of hysteria. Doña Estela had taught me that dignity is sometimes a quiet blade. You do not need to rip a fabric to mend it. There were practicalities too. Lisette Eduardo advised me to have evidence visible and undeniable. He arranged a meeting with an old notary who remembered signing my first rental contract. He called in a couple of longtime tenants who would speak to the years they had lived under agreements I had made. The papers were to be placed where the light could catch them, like an unanswerable witness. Do it in public, Eduardo told me. The truth is simplest when it has a stage. I did not relish the idea of public exposure, but what I had come to see was that secrecy had allowed a manipulator to take advantage. Secrecy was no longer shelter. It had become blindfold. I thought of the child I had held in the dark years after Javier died and made promises into a future.
I would not let someone's polished charm steal that future. The lead up to the Christmas dinner felt like the calm before a tide. I set things in place with the slowness of someone wrapping fragile glass.
I called my oldest friends, asked them to be present, people who would remember my work and who had seen the years that built those deeds. I told Rodrigo, in a gentle way that kept the room from spilling into argument, that I wanted this holiday to be honest. He nodded, and there was sadness in his agreement, but also a thin thread of courage I half expected and half feared. Valeria, unaware of the paper trail that lined the pockets of my coat, kept rehearsing the narrative that would make her the steward of our family's future. She practiced phrases like responsibility and security. She had convinced herself, and perhaps others, that centralizing was a favor. She had turned kindness into a plan. She had no idea, truly, what I carried in that old reboso. On the morning of the dinner, I felt a precise kind of peace. The house smelled of orange peel and cloves. My reboso was clean, and the edges had the faint scent of herbs I had tucked into it to keep moths away for years. I placed the documents in a leather folder that had belonged to Doña Estela and tucked it into a drawer of the sideboard, as if it were a simple utensil. Licenciado Eduardo was on his way. A couple of tenants offered to help with chairs. The table was set to be beautiful, as any table should be when it is made with care and with those we love. When we sat, the faces gathered around me were a collage of my life. Neighbors and friends, the tenants who had become like cousins, Rodrigo with his new ring glinting on his finger, Valeria smiling that practiced smile. The mole steamed and the candles burned. The moment for the toast arrived like an inhale. She raised her glass and spoke as if the sentence had been rehearsed. "From now on," she said, voice clear, "I will manage this family's money." It landed in the room like a small stone. The people across the table glanced at one another, and a few smiles broke less easily than they had before. They had applauded small accomplishments earlier, praising the meal, the decorations. This was different. This was a seizure disguised as generosity. I answered with a smile of my own. I spoke softly, the way you speak when you do not want to shatter glass, but want it to ring in the right tone. I said quietly, "You have no idea." That is where my story begins, in the way that matters. The table, the clink, the quiet smile that held more than words. The rest, how the papers moved, how Valeria reacted, how Rodrigo listened, was to be decided. There is a particular courage in being calm when you are most tempted to scream. There is strategy in waiting for the moment that makes facts visible to everyone. I felt the coolness of that moment like an old coin in my palm. And there I will leave you for now, with the sound of dinner settling, and the knowledge that the next move was not a matter of impulse, but of careful design. The work of years had led to that breath between glasses, and in the silence I felt both the weight of what I had made and the necessary lightness of revealing it on my own terms. When I said, "You have no idea," the room held its breath, as if the sentence were a bell waiting to ring. Valeria's smile tightened for half a second, and then she leaned forward as if to catch whatever applause might follow. Instead, Licenciado Eduardo stood slowly and went to the sideboard where I had left the leather folder. He did it with the gravity of a man who has spent years translating paper into protection. He set the folder on the table, unlatched it, and the papers seemed to take a breath of their own. The first thing he laid out was simple and unadorned. The old deeds with my signature in a handwriting that looked younger to me. There were photocopies of leases, receipts from decades of rent collections, little notes in the margins where a tenant had asked for a delay one winter, and I had written Monday beside the promise. There were letters from Doña Estela, browned at the edges, that gave context to the years when I learned the words I had once feared. Licenciado Eduardo spoke in a voice that did not shout, but could not be ignored. These are public records and acknowledgments. They show ownership and tenure. They are verifiable. Silence, then a low murmur. The paper rustled like dry leaves, and in that sound I felt decades of work finally become visible. A tenant across the table, Doña Marcela, whom I had helped when her child fell ill, reached out and touched a lease like someone laying fingers on a family portrait. "She fixed my roof when my husband drank his wages away," she said quietly, more to the paper than to any person. Another man nodded. He had lived in the same flat for 25 years and could quote the date he first paid rent. The room, which Valeria had expected to applaud her orderliness, now watched the papers instead. Valeria's face flushed. For a heartbeat, I saw something like calculation.
how to redirect, how to spin the presence of facts into a narrative of betrayal rather than stewardship. She rose, voice high and controlled. "This is theater," she said. "You could have told Rodrigo. You chose this spectacle." Her words were sharp and practiced, the way she had learned to arrange conversations. Rodrigo did not speak. He stood as if struck by a wind he could not name. His eyes shifted between me and the documents as if the table had become a map, and neither place felt like home. For years he had believed that my frugal habits were stubbornness. Now he watched typed names and notarized marks and realized he had been reading only footnotes of a story he had never asked to read in full. Valeria tried another tack. She pulled out a handful of receipts and a small printed statement she must have prepared, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her.
"Look," she pleaded, pointing to an indefinitive list of charges, things she called investments, things that to me read like bills and advances. "We were trying to organize things. You made choices alone that affect all of us." She turned to Rodrigo as if the sentence were a verdict already given. It is difficult to describe the way someone unravels in front of a room they thought they controlled. Her composure, the thing she had polished, faltered. She raised her voice and accused us of trying to undermine her. She said things into that anger that later people would remember and repeat. That she had been preparing a plan for the family's future, that she had been protecting Rodrigo from my secrecy. Some of those phrases were half-truths, glazed over with a sheen she had learned to make convincing. Lisette Eduardo listened, and then produced another page, this one smaller, with a few bank notices. He did not name them as scandalous, he merely placed them between Valeria and the rest of us so that they could be seen. There were a couple of notices that suggested overdue balances in places I did not recognize, a couple of cards that had been used frequently in recent months, payments and withdrawals that did not align with the neat pattern of household expenditure. When he explained them, he did not hurl accusation, he offered facts. Facts have a way of making melodrama look fragile. Rodrigo's face went pale and then hard. In his eyes I read the terrible slow dawning of betrayal, not only by the person he loved, but by a set of decisions that had been taken behind a veil of charm. He turned to Valeria and his voice was small. "Why didn't you tell me? Is this true?" he asked. She answered with words that tried to be simple. "I wanted to help. I thought I was doing the right thing." The sentence had been used often enough to be ready for an audience. It did not, for all its rehearsed softness, explain away the pattern of secrecy and small erasures. The room divided itself like something that had to choose a side. Those who had known me long, neighbors, tenants, friends, spoke quietly of memories heavier than accusation. "She paid me when no one else would," said one. "She kept me in an apartment when I had no job," said another. Their testimonies filled the space in the way that light fills a room when someone opens a curtain, slowly and inevitably. Valeria's mother, Rebecca, who had been sitting with a practiced serenity, now seemed smaller. She pulled at the edge of her shawl and uttered that old aphorism about compromise. It sounded thin. Rebecca's eyes would later be described as bewildered. She had anchored herself to the narrative her daughter had given her, and that narrative had begun to pull at its seams. When it became clear that evidence favored my account, Valeria's voice rose and she accused me of entrapment and of performing a spectacle to win a moral victory. She tried to turn the focus to the secrecy itself. Why had I hidden things? As if the moral question could erase the facts that lay between us. In other circumstances, perhaps with different people gathered at different tables, her argument would have found purchase. But at that moment, the room had been lined with names and dates and signatures that required no rhetoric. She stood up abruptly, gathered her coat, and, without waiting for Rodrigo's hand, left the house. Her departure was not graceful. There was a sudden clatter of silverware, as if someone had dropped a tray. Outside, the December air took her anger and turned it into a small, sharp noise that dropped away into the neighborhood. The door closed, with the soft, irrevocable sound doors make when they have been used as exits. Rodrigo caught his breath and sank into the chair opposite me. He was 28 and looked older by 15 years in that instant. He reached for my hand as if to find an anchor in the table. "I didn't know," he confessed, and that sentence had a grief in it that made me ache for him. He had been my boy, and now he had to learn how to be a man toward the scandal he had walked into. After Valeria left the house, the gathering dissipated like smoke. People hugged and said things that were not quite ready to be said in front of the empty coat rack. Eduardo gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder with the clinical care of someone closing a book at the end of a chapter. We did not shout. There were no dramatic confrontations.
Instead, there was a slow, painful sorting of what felt like the day's life. Plates to be washed, candles to be put out, chairs to be put away. Rodrigo stayed behind. We talked long into the night, his questions soft and confessed, my answers careful and precise. I told him again the reasons why I had protected the assets, to teach, to shelter, to ensure he would learn how to stand on his own. I told him about the promise I had made to myself in the dark months after Javier died, the letter I had written that said simply, "For Rodrigo." He listened, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, sometimes simply silent. There were admissions from both of us, about pride, about mistakes, about the ways we had failed each other. It took weeks for things to settle into a legal and emotional pattern. Valeria, for her part, sought counsel. She sent messages, some pleading, some indignant, and the ones that reached me were a mixture of explanation and accusation. Rodrigo spoke with her on the phone and came home in a state I recognized, the bewilderment of someone caught between loyalty and evidence. He told me that he loved her, but that he could not ignore the paper trail and the testimonies of those who had lived for years under my roof. He asked for time to think. I will not pretend that the months that followed were easy. There were nights when the house felt like a vessel that had lost its ballast, doors closing where there had once been music, the hum of the refrigerator filling the emptiness between rooms.
But there were also small, steady things that kept me anchored. A tenant bringing a loaf of bread because she'd seen me shut myself in for too long. A neighbor offering to weed the courtyard because my hands had stopped caring for the tomatoes. The regular calls from Leak Eduardo reporting the procedural steps we had to take to secure the portfolio legally and morally and publicly. Valeria began a process that she later described as a time of reckoning. She consulted a therapist because her mother suggested it and because someone prudent had told her she needed to address her pattern of control. She argued in therapy about intentions and outcomes, and slowly, in the careful way that therapy allows, she began to recognize how her need for order had sometimes become a hunger for power. I spoke with the therapist when asked, not to accuse, but to provide context. There is a difference between naming harm and attaching a person's whole being to it. That difference mattered. The public part of the matter, the legal confirmations, the clarity of titles, was straightforward because of the work I had done in the years before. Leak Eduardo helped us file notices where necessary, confirmed that the records were intact, and advised on establishing transparency mechanisms that would prevent similar manipulations in the future. My decision to exhibit the papers at the table had been not only defensive but also strategic. It allowed the truth to be seen by people whose memories mattered. Rodrigo and Valeria attempted to repair what had been strained between them. They met, they spoke, they tried to reconcile. But reconciliation is not a single decisive act. It is a careful, often long, building of trust and mutual accountability. For them, it did not start easily. Valeria moved out of the house she had once called our home. She rented a small apartment in town and began a job that had nothing to do with the life she had once promised to manage. The move was abrupt and messy and, to many onlookers, a necessary distancing. There were accusations that I had sought to ruin a marriage. There were counter-arguments that I had simply refused to allow manipulation to continue. The truth sat between those extremes. I had no joy in seeing a marriage fray. I had joy only in the restored clarity that allowed people to make decisions with eyes open. Time, that patient healer, began its work. Valeria, in therapy, confronted the parts of herself that had learned to disguise needs as efficiency. She recognized patterns of control she had inherited and perpetuated. Slowly, sometimes haltingly, she began to apologize, not in the theatrical way she had tried on at the table, but in letters that spoke of shame and learning. Whether those apologies were enough was something life would decide. For others, the work was to accept apology with guarded generosity, or to withhold warmth as a boundary, until actions proved trustworthiness. Rodrigo made choices about his marriage that were honest, rather than performative. Love does not always equal permanence. Sometimes to love is to let go until the hurt is addressed. They separated formally, and, in time, began the difficult work of disentangling lives that had become entangled. I offered assistance, but with boundaries. I could not in good conscience release funds without oversight. That had been a lesson learned the hard way. So we structured support that prioritized the well-being of the child we hoped for. If the child was born, I wanted him to know a foundation of responsibility rather than entitlement. When the news came that Valeria was pregnant, the family experienced a turmoil of conflicted feelings, hope braided with caution. I remember stroking the edge of my reboso and feeling that old protective impulse flare into something tender and fierce. I thought of my son as a child once, the promise I had made, and of the pair of small socks we had bought when Rodrigo was a baby, and then kept in a box because they seemed to carry luck. A new child is a new chance to name things differently. The pregnancy was a long arc of cautious conversations. Valeria invited me, unexpectedly, to attend an ultrasound appointment. I went because the image of a small heartbeat seemed to fold us toward a common future, whether we deserved it or not. There was silence in the small clinic waiting room, the kind that holds prayers and breath. When the technician smiled and said, "Everything looks well," a tiny, private joy settled in me like clean light. Mateo was born on a bright morning in late May. He smelled of milk and newness, his tiny mouth puckered in a way that collapsed my defenses. When Rodrigo held him for the first time, his face rearranged itself into a map of relief and love and contrition. I kissed his forehead and felt the slow healing that children sometimes bring to grown people. I knitted a tiny reboso for the newborn, a little thing in blue and orange, and I thought of Doña Estela and of the way textiles carry stories from one generation to the next. Parenthood rebuilt bridges in familiar and surprising ways. For Valeria, the arrival of a child softened some edges, but did not absolve all. She asked for help in caring for Mateo and in learning to budget differently. I offered to teach her, if she wanted, to manage small accounts, to understand rents and receipts. But I insisted on conditions: that we make decisions openly, that she attend at least a few sessions of financial counseling, that she agreed to oversight when it came to funds allocated for the child's well-being. She accepted with a humility that looked like growth. We arranged a trust for Mateo. It was modest in description to avoid the language of indulgence. It was generous in purpose: education, health, and a fund that would encourage entrepreneurship rather than entitlement. Lick. Eduardo sat with us as we set this up, drafting terms that required transparency and a board to oversee distributions. The board included a tenant who had known me for decades, Doña Marcela, a neighbor, and an independent trustee recommended by the notary. The idea was to create a structure where money would serve as a ladder, not a cushion that prevented learning. In the months after Mateo's birth, I became more public with the work I had put my hands into for years. The foundation, named modestly as the Amelia Mendez Fund, was set up to help widows and women like me who had sewn their lives together quietly. We offered workshops on basics: how to open an account, how to keep receipts, how to read a lease. We provided small microgrants for women starting businesses and built a mentorship network that paired experienced women with those starting out. Doña Estela agreed to be the foundation's first guide, her voice like a compass to many. The center we rented for meetings was warm and smelled of coffee and paper. It became a place where names were learned and futures plotted. Creating the foundation was not an act of triumph, but of responsibility. I wanted to transform the secret I had once hidden into a tool that could teach others to be seen and safe. We established clear bylaws and a small board that included people who had lived the narrowness of poverty. Their presence ensured that decisions would be rooted in the realities they knew. Our mission was practical: dignity through knowledge and access. There were critics who said I should have taken a harder stance, who argued that the exposure I staged was humiliating for Valeria. There were others who whispered that I had orchestrated a moral curtain to hide other motives. I listened to such voices with a calm I had earned. Criticism is often the price of standing where a truth shines. I remained careful to act in ways that were proportional and legal. Everything we did for the foundation and for the family was documented and accountable. Transparency became a virtue I insisted on in every place I could. Over time, partial reconciliation with Valeria became possible. Not because all harm was erased, but because accountability can sometimes be the path to humility and change. She attended financial classes I helped run, not as a teacher, but as a student. She wrote letters to those she had wounded, and though forgiveness is not owed, some chose to accept it as a step, not a destination. Rodrigo and I rebuilt a relationship that had become both more honest and more complicated. I was not his keeper, but I remained his mother. Our social life changed. We still celebrated birthdays and found reasons to gather. There were times when Valeria dropped by with Mateo, and there were times when she did not. The family learned to live with boundaries: scheduled visits when tempers were low, joint decisions when the child's best interest was at stake,
and the acceptance that some trust must be rebuilt slowly. We learned to speak of money openly, a practice I had once thought dangerous, but found healing when done with respect. There were small, telling moments that marked our progress. I remember a Sunday when I cooked mole, and Valeria came to help peel the seeds. She was awkward with a task that once she had used as a tool of charm. Now she learned the slow work of patience. We peeled and toasted and ground, and while the day warmed, she laughed at a joke about burnt seeds, like a woman who could take the heat now. It was not a magic unburdening, it was a tiny human step. Another afternoon, Rodrigo brought Mateo to the courtyard and taught him how to drop a pebble in the old fountain. The sound of the water smeared like balm across the edges of our days. The foundation grew slowly. We began with a handful of women who came to classes, hungry for knowledge they'd never been offered. We gave them small loans and taught them how to track expenses. Some opened little stalls in the market. One woman turned a spare room into a tailoring shop and began to mend not only clothes, but the dignity of income for her family. These victories were not grand headlines. They were the daily accumulations of people regaining voice. In public, my story became a testament to strategy rather than spectacle. I was interviewed a few times, not to revel in conflict, but to speak about the importance of teaching financial literacy and protecting one's work. I always emphasized that secrecy had been a chosen tool, not an excuse. It had been my method of sheltering a child and teaching him the meaning of work. I explained that there are many ways to hold power, and some of them are gentle. People often ask whether I bear hatred toward Valeria. I do not. Hatred is a heavy thing, and I have learned to carry lighter burdens. I bear a memory of being undermined, of being small in rooms I had helped make. I bear responsibility for mistakes, especially for a secret kept too long and the pain it created. I also carry gratitude for tenants who defended me, for friends who stood by, and for a son who eventually chose to learn with me rather than simply against me. The story's final movement has not been a dramatic reckoning, but a steady, sometimes halting work of repair. The foundation persists. Mateo grows. He will be 8 next spring, and his laugh in the courtyard is the best sound I know. Rodrigo is a better man now, not because I told him he should be, but because he faced choices and allowed himself to learn. Valeria is not erased from the narrative. She remains a figure whose mistakes and corrections teach us about power and humility. I sometimes find myself sitting with the reboso across my knees and remembering the night of the dinner. I think of the clink of the glass, of Valeria's practiced smile, and of the way the papers lay like small boats across our table. There is a pleasure now in recalling how carefully we had assembled those documents, not for vengeance, but for the bare, necessary clarity that allows families to make real choices. What I want people to leave with is not a directory of how to wage a quiet war. I want people to see dignity as a practice rather than a trophy. Protect what you build, yes, but teach those you love to respect it. Truth, when displayed with patience and legal care, has a settling power. Mercy has its place, but mercy must be given from strength, not from fear. And above all, inheritance is not only money. It is the knowledge of how to keep accounts, how to open doors for others, how to be accountable. There were moments when I thought I might have taken a harder path. Sometimes the thought of what could have been, of cold revenge or public shaming, passed like a dark cloud. But the cloud never settled. Instead, I chose to make the work I had done into a tool that others could use. The foundation is my way of passing on the table of knowledge I was given by Doña Estela. I want the women who come to us to leave the center knowing how to sign a lease, how to register a business, how to demand receipts and insist on transparency. I teach them to fold their rebosos with pride. If you have been sitting in a room where someone tries to take from you, emotionally or materially, I want you to know the power of patient preparation. You do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to make enemies without cause. You do have to be ready. The documents, the witnesses, the practiced calm, those are the things that transform whisper into fact. Protecting your legacy is an act of love, not of cruelty. The reboso on my knees has become a symbol of both the hiding and the revealing. It sheltered what needed shelter, and then, at the right time, it was folded away to show what was held. The lesson is simple and stubborn. Dignity matters more than being right in the moment. It endures, it builds. If this story resonates with you, if it stirs something you have been carrying, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what dignity has meant in your life and how you have protected what you value. Subscribe to hear more stories like this. There are many voices who have built quietly and have lessons to teach. Thank you for sitting at my table,
and for letting me tell you what I have learned about patience, protection, and the slow work of reclaiming a voice.